such an interesting point. First of all, I like the idea of a bad faith pull quote of this conversation being like, Brady, don't drink what you
Yeah,
drink what
that's
you
my big that's my big thing though. If I could write a hot take tweet, it would be do away with this language of drink what you like, because sometimes you like bad stuff and you're just wrong.
You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, and I'm joined by Billy Galanko in sunny LA.
Yes, 12th atmospheric rivers. Someday it will be sunny here again.
I still don't know what that means. I think you described it in the last one or two episodes, but I have no idea what that means. So,
yeah. Now, all you need to know is it's a flow of wet weather that somehow just targets the southern part of California. I don't know. It flows from the tropics. It's wild.
Yep, I think it's about to be spring here, so I'm excited to get out to some wineries again.
First day of spring was yesterday.
Sometime this spring. Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yep. As of recording, it is spring here at the Vint Podcast. It's a welcome season.
For sure.
It's also a new day on the Vint platform, because we have our largest collection to date is live right now. This is new as of this recording and should still be on the platform now. We have seen pretty high level of demand for such a high value collection. This is our $315,000 Kurosawa cask collection. So we have 3 whiskey casks from the previously closed and now reopened in a new location, Kurosawa Distillery. It's really unique, offering assets that we acquired at extreme scarcity. I believe only 25 or so casks came out of Japan on offer, and we got 3 of them. So if there are still shares left in that collection, definitely check it out. And we do have our Domaine Laflave. Correct my French if I'm wrong, Billy. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's like Laflave, but you're
kind of accent missing there. Laflave. Yeah. Sure. That offering may or may not still be live on the platforms. We announced that a couple of days ago, and as of the time that most of you will be hearing this podcast, may or may not still be on the platform, but continuing to offer a mix of wine and whiskey here, and a lot of great opportunities. So definitely check it out.
Yeah, just to build on
Billy, you want to talk a little bit? Yeah, you want to talk a little about the Kurosawa offering?
Yeah. I think this one is one that was near and dear to my heart. And when we got the opportunity, we were approached through our various sourcing channels on the opportunity to buy a few of these casks. It was really exciting. So if anybody taking one step back, they stopped distilling at Kurosawa in 2000, and they had dismantled the distillery in 2011, 2012, and sold off some of the pieces. So what they did now, they took multiple years to restart the distillery. They basically created new stills that were in the shape and exact design of the old distillery. They brought on old managers and staff from the past distillery. So basically what they're looking to do is really recapture that special nature that happened before. So they're going to be working with the same types of different barleys, different malts, as well as the same process, sherry casks. What's really exciting is basically they're looking to continue on this tradition that Kurosawa had built since the 50s or so. So with these casks available, like Brady said, only 25 were sold outside of Japan. This initial run was, I believe, just 250 casks. We're going to be among some of the first whiskey ever reproduced there in 2023 here. Yeah, it's really a unique opportunity. And I guess the final piece that's really exciting is the naming rights and bottling rights. The whiskeys will not be able to be bottled before 10 years old. So we'll be able to potentially sell the casks before then. But if we do hold one or all of them till 10 years, we'll be able to bottle them with whatever logo branding we would like to put on it, but we'll be able to use the Kurosawa name. So if you think of the geisha collections or some of the other things that have been created with the old Kurosawa casks, there's a ton of opportunities for exits for this, both bottling and direct selling of the casks.
That's really neat. We could do a Vint podcast. Vint podcast style bottling.
That'll be
lots of demand for that, I'm sure.
Our 100,000th download. Somebody gets a bottle from there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, speaking of scarce or maybe rare, hard to find whiskeys. I won a bottle of Old Forester 2022 birthday bourbon from a local ABC lottery. So one of
So
the
what does
local
the birthday
counties
mean?
nearby me. Yeah. They do one every year. I don't know the whole story behind it, but every year they release a new bottling of this quote unquote birthday bourbon. I'm not sure what the original birthday was in terms of what it was celebrating, or if they're just like their vintage expression of each of these whiskeys. I don't know a ton about it. I do know that I was able to purchase it near MSRP, and it's a bottle that's worth somewhere between $700 and maybe $1,200. So it's in the range of assets that you might see in something like a bourbon whiskey collection from Vint if we were to have one in the future. So it's cool. It was the first asset of that category that I've had access to at low, close to MSRP versus secondary pricing. So not sure if I'm going to keep it or if I'll try and offload it and sell it. So if you're interested, reach out. Always inquire.
So two things. I want you to explain in a second why you have to get it through a lottery. Because for some of us who aren't from Virginia or weird places and control states, that might be a little foreign. And two, I just looked up what it is, and they are celebrating the birthday of the founder. So this year, or the 2022, marked the 152nd year of the company since it began in 1870. Celebration of the
Nice.
founder, George Garvin Brown's birthday. Yeah, there you go.
So I guess the 2020 bottling is the one you want. That's the 150 year bottling, huh? Commemorative.
In theory, I guess bottling, commemorative, but then also their age. This one just says it was aged for tasting panel. The 11-year-old barrels were chosen. So this one was still distilled in 2011. So maybe you want the one that was distilled in 2020.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in terms of allocated whiskeys, there's a couple of different ways that like government controlled counties or states across the country might do this. So there are plenty of places in the US where local stores are privately owned. They can set their own prices for any assets that they acquire. And there are other places where the government controls those liquor stores and the distribution and resale of those whiskeys. A lot of times there are restrictions on how much of a markup can be placed on those highly allocated whiskeys. For instance, where I live in Maryland, most of the counties, if you find a quote unquote rare bottle, it could be 5 to 10 times MSRP value because they can set whatever price they want. But there's one county a little bit north of DC here that is county controlled. And so anytime they get these highly desirable, highly allocated whiskeys in, they're going to sell them for around MSRP. And so one of the ways they handle demand when they do get shipments is to either have highly allocated days where they release these highly allocated assets and people will line up outside the store to get them. And then for the ultra rare ones where maybe there's not a full case, maybe there's just one or two bottles that they get. For instance, like these birthday bourbons, like a lot of the Pappy Van Winkle bottles, George T. Stagg, and others that you really don't find on the shelf anywhere. And you can't buy a case of Pappy just off a shelf anywhere in the US. They'll do lotteries. So you actually just submit and rank all of your assets based on what, you desire the most. And if your name gets drawn, they'll give you the opportunity to purchase at MSRP the bottle that you've ranked the highest at that time. So that's how I got this opportunity. Even Billy in California, where they tend to have better distribution there in terms of kind of run of the mill bottles that are distributed widely, you still wouldn't be able to walk into any store in California really and purchase this bottle for MSRP. You could maybe purchase it, but it would be marked up to between $700 and $1,200 most likely. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. That's a special bottle. According to this last bit of description on there, it says the allotment represents 1 day's production of Old Forester. I don't know if that's 1 day of like their whole distillery or one whatever, but that's funny. They're really leaning into the actual birthday type thing. So that's cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, relatively scarce if you think of just 1 day of production. I'm not sure how many they churn out. I should know that because we actually toured there in Kentucky after you guys left. It was a few of us went over to Old Forester. And so, yeah, maybe it was meant to be. Cool. I'll keep people updated on how that goes. But let's get into our interview today. We're lucky to have Emily Saladino, who is a writer, an editor, recipe developer. She used to work at Wine Enthusiast full time. She's now a writer at large at Wine Enthusiast. She studied at the Institute of Culinary Education. She has some WSET WSET certifications, has been a writer at Thrillist and VinePair, other popular level content creators, newsletters, online kind of journalism for food and beverage. And she's, really smart about the consumer markets as well as just wine and food in general. So we had a great conversation about all things wine, including pairing, consumer trends, and hopefully some projects that we threw around some ideas, projects that would be really cool for folks in the wine and food industry to work on in the future.
Yeah. And I do want to add that she also, being a writer at large, she's also like the key critic or reviewer, I guess, for Georgian and Greek wines, which we touch on, which are some things that I find really fascinating. So she's a specialist in some of these kind of unique areas that are really just starting to gain some more traction in the US.
Yeah, she's awesome. She's a great personality. And I hope you guys enjoy the interview. Here is Emily Saladino. Hey, Emily, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we've had a couple writers on the podcast in the past, mainly critics, a few folks who write like popular level blogs and things like that. I think your approach and your history of writing across the industry, both in wine, but also recipes and other kind of subcultures of food and wine is really interesting. So how did you come to the place you're at now? Did you always want to be a writer, or was maybe wine your first love? How did that come about?
I guess I came into wine and to journalism through food. I knew I always wanted to somehow work with food and hospitality. I love it. That's probably my first love. I started out working in cookbooks, and I really love recipe development, testing recipes. I love what sharing a meal and a glass with people does, the way it opens up conversations, the way it opens up, this is a bit hokey, but it opens up your mind a bit, right? Like it can in the most grandiose or the most day-to-day ways. You can be like, oh, wow, I don't typically put mustard on that sandwich. Or you can be like, wow, you really raised some fascinating points in that conversation, right? It can be as basic or as grand as it is. And so that's always been for me a huge draw. I knew I wanted to spend my days doing that, trying to relate to different people, trying to understand points of views different from my own. And so I was working in food for many years. I wound up getting a job in a tech company, working with a lot of food and restaurant, like travel writing, people who write up descriptions of points of interest around the globe. And so that was at Google, working with Google Maps. And that was a really fascinating experience because, again, it spoke to the diversity of perspectives. Seeing there are cities that I've not been to that I was talking to writers on the ground being like, okay, so is that the sort of restaurant you would take like your new girlfriend's parents to in Kuala Lumpur? So I think that experience, it made me really excited to work in different ways in food and beverage. And I went to culinary school. I worked in kitchens for a few years as a cook, but I knew I would that I were the sort of person who could spend my life in a kitchen. I think I don't have the joint health for it. It's a really physically demanding work, and mentally and emotionally. And so I started freelance writing for a while. And from there, through food, I came into wine. So I am not someone who grew up in a wine drinking household. It's funny because in my work now at Wine Enthusiast, I've written for a lot of publications that are consumer facing about wine. And I'll use these kind of like shorthand descriptors being like, in the same way that your parents' generation may have collected Bordeaux. And it's just hilarious to me because like my parents didn't collect Bordeaux. My parents didn't collect any wine. And so I use these shorthands sometimes, and I have to laugh at myself while I'm doing it because I don't have a wine background. It was through working in restaurants, got exposure to it. And so whenever people tell me I'm interested in a career in wine, how did you get into it? I'm so happy to tell them that I came by it with no prior experience or expertise. I came to it through restaurants where you get a chance to taste so much. With whether or not you have the bank account to be tasting top shelf bottles, you have access to it. And hopefully you work with people who see your interest and give you a chance to have a little taste of something else that you might not have tried before. And that's what viscosity is. And I think I learned on the ground by doing. And from there, I got this job at a startup called VinePair, which is now, I don't think they would identify as a startup anymore. But at the time, we were just a scrappy group of like 12 people in a room. And I worked there for 2.5 years. And that's where I would say I really got my hardcore wine education. I took WSET classes while I was there, but also just in the day-to-day of being surrounded by people talking and writing about and discussing wine. And from there, I went to Wine Enthusiast, where I was first the associate managing editor and then the digital managing editor. And then last summer, I left full-time there, and I now work as a writer at large for the publication, which is a title I find hilarious. You guys, you can't see how tall I am, but I'm like very short. So I find being a writer at large funny. I'm just an enormous writer. And I also review wine from Georgia, Cyprus, and Greece for Wine Enthusiast now.
Awesome. So
sorry, that was like my CV. I don't know. Did you want all that?
That's good. I was wondering what the writer at large title, what does that practically mean? Does it basically mean you are still writing the same amount as maybe you were before, but you're not on the full-time staff? What does it mean?
So for me, it is a way to contribute editorially through writing, but I'm no longer on the ground as an editor. So I'm no longer, when I was on staff there, I was editing the work that you would see on the website. It is no longer my role. And yes, and I'm no longer full time. So that's why you'll also see like my byline will appear elsewhere. And the decision behind that for me was the chance to go freelance and to focus more on writing. If you work in media, I don't know if it's the same in all forms, but in a lot of print and digital media, if you're lucky enough to have longevity at companies, you'll advance. And I found myself getting further and further away from the act of writing and more into editing and just other pieces of the business. And so I was excited for the chance to go back. And I was going to say pen to paper, although who does that anymore?
Sure.
Fingers to keyboard sounds so much less romantic. My thumbs to my phone. I was just excited for the chance to get back into the act of writing and reporting.
So when you're working with publications like Bon Appetit and say that article you wrote on orange wine, is that something you then pitch to them, or how does that work?
Yes. So in the case of that article for Bon Appetit about the incredible possibilities of orange wine to teach people who are new to wine, curious about wine, about it at large. That came about because I pitched a story to Bon Appetit of related, but not that exact story. And then through conversations, the editor who I work with, Serena Dye, is such an incredibly insightful, thoughtful editor. She and I had a couple of conversations like on the telephone, which I realize doesn't sound revolutionary, but in the digital world that we live in, where we're all sending emails and texts and DMs all day, sometimes like getting on the telephone feels, my goodness, like, how is this real life? So no, she and I had a few conversations and we hammered out that story idea about the ways that orange in particular as this kind of amorphous thing in wine, like skin contact and macerated. There's all sorts of different things that get caught up in that word orange and how it has this great potential to teach people who, particularly folks who might be newer to wine. It's very popular in people. Natural wine is another nebulously defined term, but orange tends to be closely linked to natural wine for logical and illogical reasons. And so what sort of great potential there is there, as opposed to just brushing it off as, these people don't even know what skin contact means, to see it as a possibility and say, there's people ordering this. And if you ask them how to define it, some of them will know, but some of them won't. Like, what an opportunity there is there.
Yeah, we were going to dive into it, I think, a little bit more later, but I want to get into it now just because I completely agree. Can you explain a little bit? You go into your article, but as someone who's tried to drag their friends into wine as I've gotten into it over the years, talking to somebody about the nuances of a region, I think you used the example of Pouilly-Fumé, and it's just telling them that the Sauvignon Blanc came from these Silex soils. Nobody really seems to care, but for some reason, when I have an orange wine, I'm like, this was made in a pot in the ground in Georgia. They're like, cool, tell me more. I'm like, oh, you actually want to hear about this now? What do you think it is? And it's they're open to, they want to know what grapes are in it now. I'm like, now you want to know. It's
I love that. First of all, I think your friends and the Venn diagram of your friend group and mine, I think, has a lot of overlap because I have had very similar experiences. No, I think there's such a For reasons that I really understand and relate to, there can be such a knee-jerk reaction in wine. I think we've all been in that circumstance where like someone is like swirling like a big oversized Bordeaux glass and like telling me like, oh, I'm picking up quince. And I'm like, I don't know what quince actually smells like. I think the sort of accessibility aspect of orange to me is that's the je ne sais quoi, right? It's the fact that you haven't had people overly explaining or under talking over you to under explain is I guess the language I'm going to use. I think we haven't had that as much in the US because we have a shorter experience with skin contact wines. That's my theory. And I think that's a lot of the appeal of natural too to people is just that you don't have to know everything about varieties and about like the classification systems of Burgundy in order to enjoy it. There's often a fairly accessible price point. I think that the price of wine can be let's just say it's a broad spectrum. In beer, like the best beer in the world, I might be able to taste it for $60. I might not be able to get my hands on it, but if I were able to, it's $60. I will never afford DRC. Never say, guys, who knows what this life has for me? But at the current rate I'm going, I don't see my financial supporting such a purchase. And so I think like that's part of the appeal to me of orange wine is that you haven't been listening to people talking to you about it for a long time. So it feels fresh. It feels really open. Not everyone knows about it. So also it's not embarrassing not to know. I think sometimes with the Sauvignon Blanc having so many different names in so many corners of the world, am I supposed to have already learned that? Is that the sort of thing that I should know already? I think that can be really intimidating. I'm guilty of it. Just on a totally unrelated note, I watched the All Quiet on the Western Front. They like recently made a version of it. I watched it last weekend. And at the end of it, I was like, no spoilers. I don't know if everyone here has read or seen it.
We have a huge following in that population.
Yeah, this is actually also an All Quiet on the Western Front podcast. But no, at the end, it's a sad ending. And I was so sad. And the people I were watching it with were like, did you not know that story? And the answer is no. I never read it in school. I didn't know it. And so I think there can be this embarrassing thing where you're like, oh, I should pretend I've read the canon, right? And so I think similarly in wine, you're like, I should pretend I know all of the names that Sauvignon Blanc go by around the world, even though there's no way. You shouldn't have to. And like few of us do. I mispronounce things in wine all the time. And like that's okay too. Yeah. I do think there's a little bit of, I don't know, a little like intimidation that we get in our own ways in that way.
Yeah, I found that like orange and natural wines, I can say wine is usually made this way. This is not made that way. See what you think. And it's a really easy kind of conversation. And if people like it, they like it. If they don't, and like you said, that an accessible price point makes it like, even for me who like has more wine knowledge than my friends, I don't have much knowledge about all the different types of natural wines and fermentation and these kinds of things. But if you like it, it's good. And that's actually a part of wine that I permit myself to say that, because in some of the other categories like Bordeaux and Burgundy and Napa and these, I don't really agree with the drink what you like, because there's such strict stylistic ways that the grape quote unquote should be expressed that it's more rigid. And so I think in like natural wines, it provides more flexibility.
That's such an interesting point. First of all, I like the idea of a bad faith pull quote of this conversation being like, Brady, don't drink what you like.
Yeah, that's my big thing though. If I could write a hot take tweet, it would be do away with this language of drink what you like, because sometimes you like bad stuff and you're just wrong. But in natural wine, you're allowed to like anything.
Right. No, I think that's a really provocative point. I remember one of the first articles that I edited at VinePair, and I was like, man, am I out over my skis, was, excuse me, I was editing Jamie Good about like the importance of wine critics, the space that they occupy in wine, and how like some people's palates are better than others. And it was obviously like a provocative thing, because all of us like to believe this is America. People have this mythological idea that we all can just pull ourselves and become wine experts. And I actually do believe that anyone can, but I also do think there's validity to like like anything, you undergo training. I was much worse at rolling out pastry before I went to culinary school. I had to
Right,
learn
right.
that skill, right? And so I'm able to detect notes that I wasn't able to detect before I went to WSET classes, right? It's just a skill. So I think it's a very provocative point, right? And like you're getting at something that I think is complicated for people who don't live and breathe wine, which is like typicity, right? That's also a hard thing to, I don't know. I think it's a hard sell, really. More than even, I was going to say it's hard to explain. I think it's easy to explain. I think it's hard to get people on board if they're not. I don't know. What do you all?
Well, yeah, have wine enthusiasts email me. I'm happy to write an article expounding on why you're wrong if you like think that you like Syrah, not Cab or something. I don't know.
Former digital editor in me just sees the traffic.
A lot of potential here for me.
If you're willing to go on record with some of these statements, then a digital editor will assign it.
Yeah, I guess I'll play devil's advocate to Brady. The more that I've gotten into wine, and it's funny because I'm going down the WSET track a little further, hopefully wrapping up the diploma and then maybe going further. And we're trained now to describe a wine maybe as like simple or like lower, higher value, lower cost to create. And so there are these tiers of wine. It's not like necessarily what Brady's getting at is bad. It just might be like the way it's made. Because I don't want anybody out there thinking, I like a really simple, trying to think of like an Entre de Mer, like Bordeaux, which is basically just going to be like really simply made Merlot. That's what it's supposed to taste like. But compared to maybe Petrus, Brady might say that's a bad one and this is a good one.
So
I think that's
I agree with you actually. So I think that more the distinction is you can't say that you like wine if like you only drink Napa and you say, oh, I don't like white wine, or oh, I like Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, but I don't like white Burgundy. Like these things, I've never met someone who actually likes wine who draws those kinds of distinctions, and those are just their quote unquote preferences. I just don't agree with that.
Emily, I did want to get your point of view on. So what I was going to say on the orange wine front is I think people have a mindset when they're trying wines. Either they don't know enough to know what good wine is like Brady, or they have their favorites already. They're like, this is what I think red wine should taste like. This doesn't, I don't like it. White wine, same. So orange, they're coming in with a fresh point of view and they're like,
yeah,
oh, I want to learn a little bit about this. I think there is an extra element that they're willing to learn more. And our generation seems to be more interested in learning the nuances behind wine. But what do you think about that? Is it because people have never had them before and they don't know what to compare them to?
I think that's really interesting. I think at risk of sounding Pollyanna, I think they're all of these points are true. We all contain multitudes. No, I do. I think
media
that
trained.
Yeah, you guys.
Billy and I just start. Yeah.
There's someone off count. You can't see them like holding up placards, but they're like, "Be nice." No, I do actually think there's truth to that too, though, right? If it's the year 2002 and I live in New York and I've not ever had a rosé before, no one's handed it to me, I might be open to it in a way because I don't yet know what it should taste like. The tricky counterpoint of that is if I have a really young, fresh Gamay, it tastes very different from a heavy Napa Cab. So color is important, but it's not everything. So that's the counterpoint to it is even if I haven't, there's so much diversity in orange. I think that's a huge part of why it can reach so many people. You can have this really heavy hitting, almost oily on the palate thing that you want to have with lamb. And then you can have an orange wine that's poolside sip. And they're both fall under that same umbrella. But that is the tricky part, is I would argue there's similar diversity in all of the colors. Maybe less in rosé. Okay, I'm just going to say it. The rosé people come for me. I'm ready for you. No, I think there's less within that category. But yeah, so that is the counterpoint, and that's what I think is part of what makes wine both delightful and so hard to get people into. Is it's like English grammar. There's exceptions to every rule, and then there's exceptions to those exceptions. And then every time I think I'm going to spell niece correctly, I don't. So there's too much gray area, and then there's too many contradictions. And as I said, I think that's part of what makes me interested in it, is that I feel like I'll never be a true expert. I think once you stop having things to learn, I don't know. If you're working wine and you're like, I've learned all I need to learn, I'm probably not going to enjoy sitting next to you at a dinner party. But that's also what I think can make it really hard to get my friends who are just like, dude, I just want something nice to drink with dinner. That makes it hard for me to be like, oh, but this farming technique is very exciting. It's a harder entry point because there are so many complexities and there are so many contradictions.
And that's the most exciting part, though, introducing your friends to wine, is them just drinking more wine on Tuesdays and Thursdays than they did before, I think. And think about your recipe writing maybe as being able to lend to that a little bit. Billy and I were talking offline about, does anyone do recipe, right, especially for like online publications where they're doing wine pairings with the recipe? I think that would be really cool. And I don't want to publicly divulge my plans for a new web platform. But yeah, how do you think about that? Like, how does that go hand in hand with getting people to drink more wine on a weeknight?
I would love that. I don't know. There's so many people on the internet. Someone's doing something cool, but I have not seen that. And maybe there's a quarter of TikTok that I've not found and someone's doing this. No, I actually would love that. I think that socials in particular, to me, social media in particular, is really exciting and, in my opinion, underutilized in wine because I'm not a marketer by trade, but they say you meet people where they are. And if you want to get Gen Z and millennial consumers, that's where we are. So I think there's such an opportunity there for people who there's a lot of really great recipe creators especially on Instagram and TikTok. I think there's some bad ones, but there's some good ones. And if they were doing things with wine pairings, there's such a wine education opportunity there. It's so untapped there. I'm not saying no one's doing it, but like it's Wild West. There's so much space to do something really thoughtful that could last. So no, if you launch this, I'm your first subscriber. I'm on board.
Yeah, I have so many cookbooks where if you were to go out and buy the ingredients for these like very complex dishes, it would cost you like $80. So I'm like, throw a $30 bottle of wine on top of it, and you'd have a great meal.
I love that. Actually, that would be a really smart, while we're just coming up with businesses, that would be a great like e-commerce platform. You know how when you go onto a lot of recipe sites, it'll say, fill your cart. And you're like, okay, I need to buy harissa or whatever. That would be great. You could be like, also, I'm going to buy this particular Chardonnay. It's a good idea.
Nice. We'll talk offline. Yeah,
we'll circle back.
Hold on, creating the LLC right now.
I can't wait, Brady. Ship to California, hopefully. But so on one of your points you mentioned, if you're speaking to different generations about both food and wine, like you've written for like Thrillist, Wine Enthusiast now, which are like on polar ends of the spectrum, and I'd call VinePair somewhere in between. Do you change the way you speak to these people, or are you trying to have like, your voice that's consistent through, or both, probably?
Oh, Billy, this is the best, this is the question that I think any journalist who writes for many publications grapples with. No, it's such a good question. It's a challenge because, yes, you absolutely have to speak differently to different audiences. I speak differently to you two than I do to my mom, who will hold one glass of wine for about 5 hours and isn't a drinker. And so we're going to have a different conversation about wine than I do with my mother. So yes, I definitely do change both the way something is written, the sources that you use, the story itself, all of those things will shift for the publication and its audience. That being said, I am the most passionate believer in, I don't think you ever talk down. I think people meet you. You can go up. People meet you. If they're interested in the subject matter, they'll meet you there. And I do think I do think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think sometimes, particularly in digital, only because it's bigger, there's more of it in digital publishing, there can be a tendency to just, okay, we got to get those eyeballs and the 5 red wines you need to try. Like, that's not real. No one's really learning from that. And so I think that you can speak to everyone with sensitivity and intelligence. I will put that on my tombstone. I believe that very deeply. But yeah, there's definitely language that I use that's different for VinePair than for Wine Enthusiast. When I went from one to the other, I remember I was like, oh, we use different terms here. We say things like a pour, singular, to mean like a glass of wine. It's like small things that speak to a different type of consumer, a different generation sometimes, but also just maybe someone who considers themselves more of a wine industry insider, whether or not they are. And so I think that's like that's a silly, but like a small detail I noticed going from one to the other. And now that I work freelance and I write for different audiences, I just wrote a story for Food and Wine that was a beginner's story about identifying what cork taint is. And the approach that I gave to it was, when I was taking WSET classes, I remember the professor opened a bottle of corked wine, not intentionally, and he was like, oh, wine is corked. What a cool opportunity. Everyone can smell it. And I thought it smelled fine. So I was like, yeah, wine smells like wine. I didn't like, I was just like copying what my like other classmates were saying. And I was like, cardboard, totally. And so I think, what the point I wanted to make was like, it's okay if you don't yet know what corked means, right? Do you just think that means it has a cork in it? It's okay. We all start from someplace and like we all have to get there. And Food and Wine is a publication that some people read who have a ton of wine expertise. So it varies by the outlet, but it also varies by the story. And as you said, the tricky part is you always want it to sound like you as the writer. And that's a hard thing to do. That's a hard thing to maintain your voice. But I also am of the mindset that it's not really about like, I didn't get into journalism because I want to be a star. I got into journalism because I love communicating and talking to people and learning from people. So I think that you as the journalist also have a responsibility to take a backseat to your audience and to your story.
I like how, we're talking one way about trying to potentially explain wine or introduce that to another audience. We went through a bunch of your old articles and looking at how you had to talk about Jay-Z and how he changed champagne, but to a wine enthusiast article. That's the other way. It's like not bringing wine to culture, it's bringing culture to wine. I like that was really interesting. Number one, did you have any difficulties in quoting these artists? One, getting clean quotes. I also noticed how you said Cristal's complicated history with hip hop, which is putting it nicely. And then, that was just an interesting article. And how do you write that for that audience? I thought that was cool.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I love that you caught that really understated, complicated. That word complicated does a lot of work in that sentence. I think that particular story, for the record, it was in print. And so there's a limited word count. I had written that for digital. I think I could have gone a little bit more into, here's what I mean when I say the history of Cristal and champagne. So for those listening who are blessedly unawares, Cristal obviously was mentioned in so many rap lyrics for, I'm going to say decades, for a really long time, late 90s all the way through the aughts. And then there's a quote where I can't remember the man's, and like a Cristal executive gave a quote saying something about how we can't stop them from drinking it. And Jay-Z, a savvy business person, was like, oh, that's racist. Absolutely not. I will never drink Cristal again. And created his own champagne company, Ace of Spades. Well, he actually bought an existing historic champagne house, Ace of Spades. And so I wanted to allude to that in talking about the J, without getting into the history of what I just did, where I'm like, quick tangent. So that is the way to do it, rather that I did it there. I think you could have written a different story about Jay-Z and champagne and talked a lot about that. And I think I would love to read 3,000 words on racism and champagne. Like I would read that article tomorrow. So I think there's a lot of ways to approach that because, as you said in that particular story, and I thought you said it really beautifully, like bringing culture to wine as opposed to wine. That particular story was about the ways that like Jay-Z in particular and hip hop in general have really brought a lot to champagne and sparkling wine. And like they've brought a ton of consumers, they brought a ton of cultural credibility. I don't think that people in Champagne worry about their cultural credibility. Maybe they do, but I think Champagne's good. I think they're sitting pretty, but I also think that none of us can really afford to ignore new consumers, or in the case of hip hop and champagne, existing consumers. So I think that's for me, that was a really cool opportunity to look at something that's been happening, but that many publications like Wine Enthusiast hadn't yet really explored, haven't really written about. These stories are happening, are being told. There's a lot of great people in wine who I don't know always get the same degree of mainstream recognition as others. And I think Jay-Z is a great example. Love him or hate him, you love his music, you don't, you like his politics, you don't, whatever. Like the guy is like a savvy businessman. I don't think any of us, in the same way that I think most people in Champagne are doing okay in terms of like their wine's global footprint. Like I think Jay-Z is like doing all right. I think that guy's got his life sorted. And so I just think the chance to shed a light on that corner of wine culture, I think is really cool.
Yeah, it touches on consumers. Talked a little bit about what do you think what are the big consumer trends maybe in Gen Z and I guess younger millennials maybe that are driving, some interest in this space right now? I think I put in our show notes talking about leaning on your recipe writing. Do we have more foodies these days than we quote unquote self-proclaimed foodies these days? And because I feel like so many of my friends can't cook. I think we grew up in this middle where our parents like either cooked every meal at home or that every meal was like bought out or frozen and thawed or something like that. And yeah, I found that I either have friends who are excellent cooks or can't fry an egg thing.
No, you hit on one of my I don't know, my hot button issues, which is I hate the word foodie so much. What does that mean?
Very good.
I don't know, like you consume food to live, same. I'm not a fan at all. But no, I do. I think there are a lot of self-proclaimed experts in every corner of the world. Again, you look to TikTok, someone who like, I don't know how much work they've done in mental health, like telling me how to grieve. I think there's a lot of self-proclaimed experts out there. I think in wine, in terms of reaching younger, just chronologically younger consumers, I think there's so much there that hasn't been tried because a lot of the decision makers just worry that it's different. Of course, each generation is different than the one before. The folks who I worked with, like at Thrillist, a lot of the folks I worked with on the editorial team I was on were quite a bit younger than me, were like early 20s. And I got to tell you, it was fascinating. Like I learned so much from these people. I was like, you were in college during the pandemic. Just so many interesting, like different life perspectives. I think there's a lot of people of that generation who I'd love to see us market a slightly more premium product to people who have less disposable income. I realize that sounds counterintuitive, but like one of the biggest hurdles I think in wine is to get people into it is the point of sale, the price point. And if you started marketing, I think they say like the average, it's like a $14 bottle of wine is what most Americans are purchasing. So if you say someone's going to spend $14, I want to try to get them to spend 20 once a week instead of 14 every 3/4 of a week. There's so much there because I think one of the problems with getting folks into wine is let's say you spend $14 and you're like, that's a chunk of change for me. I'm not trying to do that and not like what I open and have a whole bottle to muscle through. But I think you can find a way to say, instead of buying one $14 bottle every week, I want you to buy a $20 bottle every week and a half. I'm making up these numbers, you guys. But if you change that calculus a little bit, you can get people into tasting things that might open them up to other, like a whole other world of wine. There's such a divergence in a smaller price point. I think on the lower end of the scale, if you're spending a small amount of money and you're able to spend $2 more, makes a world of difference. The hard thing there is that when, the younger you are, the less likely you are to have a ton of disposable income. So it's a matter of reaching those people, marketing to them, finding products that they are able to afford. Because I do think people in the Gen Z and the young millennial generations, we do spend on food and beverage, right? That is where we spend a lot of our disposable income. So finding ways to get by the glass wine programs in every corner of every city and town, right? So it's not just, I live in Yonkers now. I live just north of New York City proper. Radically different. I live 2 miles north of the Bronx, and it is a radically different scene in a wine bar, right? It's a lot of huge companies. It's not a lot of, you have to really seek out to find these smaller, what I find more exciting, interesting producers. And that's not a slam against big companies. They do what they do well. I think that bringing that sort of diversity of offerings to younger consumers is the answer, and finding ways to market a slight premiumization. I'm not talking about spending $50 a glass for someone who's 22. I don't do that now, but I do think that finding a way to market a slightly pricier so that you're buying better quality in lower quantity, I think that's a move. I think that's I'm not the person to do it. I'm not a salesperson, as I'm sure you can tell. I'm sure a salesperson would eat this to shreds, but I do think there's opportunity there because people are spending and they are drinking less, but better.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the comment of, I think folks in younger generations are willing to spend on things like food and travel, and these talking about like on the recipe or maybe home cooking side. I have so many friends who that's like their budget area. They have a strict budget is like their grocery bill. And so they'll go to, this is not slamming these companies, just not slamming the wine companies, but like Lidl and Aldi to buy their meat. And it's like, why is this section of your life, which one is the food you consume, very important and should be one of the more enriching things that you spend money on, the thing that you assign like the tightest budgetary constraints against. And you make your decisions strictly based off of where can I go to get this product the cheapest. I think that probably spills over into the beverage category as well. Of course, I certainly have friends who spend no money on food and buy really expensive IPAs, so we can get them to wine. Yeah, I've seen that though, that, friends who will travel a ton, but then they'll spend $30 on groceries a week.
No, it's funny you say that. I see that too, because I will say almost all of the disposable income I have goes toward food and beverage. I think surprising no one. And like I, at the same time, like I don't spend a lot of money on clothes. I don't get my nails.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I think we all have spaces where we like assign value. And you could make the argument that by me not like spending money on good clothes, what am I doing? Am I supporting the fast fashion industry? Like maybe there's people could turn that on me. I think that is hard. I think getting people to cook at home is a similar hurdle in the sense that like you can feel really intimidated by it, especially if you're someone who loves to go out to eat, because you're like, I can't do that. But it's same. I can't do a lot of what I see in restaurants. But once you understand, it's like wine tasting, right? That's for me, that was a big crossover, is once you understand breaking down what you taste in a sort of like geometric way, like the Samin Nosrat, salt, fat, acid, heat, the WSET thing. I think once you break things down that way, it's really helpful. You're like, okay, I can't create like a stone-fired pizza with shaved black truffles on it, but I liked the char and I liked the acidity of the tomatoes and I liked the richness of the truffles. What can I do at home where I'm like going to make a piece of toast and it's going to have something tangy on it and going to have lemon butter on it instead of traditional butter, right? We get there, like baby steps, one meal at a time. And so I think that's what, I don't know if I'm making sense on the wine front, but I do think that's what I want to do with younger consumers is, okay, you're willing to spend $16 on a glass of wine and you typically would only spend 12 because I've told you this is biodynamic. I don't know if you know, we might not even have the same idea of what biodynamic means, but let's say that's a value of yours. So like, how can I do that writ large? How can I find a way to reach what matters to you? And then you're comfortable spending a little bit more and you'll have one glass instead of two.
That the value also, like there is that trend, I guess people are drinking less in general, think the younger generation. So I think the argument for fewer but better could make sense. I think by the glass is definitely going to be a great entry point. And something that Brady's mentioned before, circling back to the orange wine thing, is he said he's introduced a bunch of his friends who drink beer to wine via like the profile of like a skin contact or a natural wine. I have a dive bar that's down the road. I also live in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, so of course they do, but they're also owned by a natural wine bar. So they have orange wine by the glass as well as like things to cater to the traditional hipster like Pabst. So it's interesting there, though, is like people who are going to like this random rock concert or they want to do in this like little tight venue are also drinking orange wine next to people like just drinking really cheap beer. So I think that's like an interesting bridge that you can cross.
Oh, I love that. I think that's really interesting too, that like your local dive has orange. I think that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have a champagne night where we just serve Miller Lite and like champagne of beers kind of thing.
I've told you this before, and you might have been there, Emily, if you ever went to San Francisco before it shut down. There was a wine bar called the Riddler. It was only champagne in San Francisco, and they had Miller Lite as well because they had everything champagne.
Yeah.
I love that. No, it's funny. I actually think getting folks who are into beer into wine sounds like a really tough challenge. I'm glad to hear there's been success on that front, Brady. I think that's impressive. I think that there's more opportunities with that the younger we get too. Now, we're not like Benjamin buttoning ourselves, but like the younger we shift our gaze. Speaking for myself, I don't know what you guys are into, but no, I think the younger we shift our gaze, the more opportunity there is. Because Billy, as you said, like there have been studies that people are drinking less. And there's like this tendency in the wine industry, we like clutch our pearls over it. And we're so distraught that we're losing market share. And I think instead it's like, why are we? And maybe it's increasing that price point. Maybe it's meeting people who are beer drinkers with sours, rather with meeting people who are wine drinkers with sour beers and meeting people who are beer drinkers with orange wine. Like I think there's ways, or even just a lot of natty. I think there's a lot of like natural wines that to me there's a crossover with some wild beers. I don't want to say anything that will upset the natural wine community because You all may have noticed, but the natural wine community on the internet have feelings. And I'm not saying anything disparaging, but I do think that there is some crossover in that sort of unfiltered wild beer and that sort of unfiltered natural wine. Like you can reach someone on a similar, almost agricultural level. And so like I do think there is possibility. And even with like people are so worried about cannabis, but look at what's happening in cannabis. There's all of these cool cannabis beverages now. And what is that but another opportunity to change wine bars, to change by the glass programs? Like that's in the future. But that's not tomorrow. But I do think that like instead of worrying about how our silo is getting smaller, we can worry about that we're silo and maybe change that aspect of it. Like having the orange at the dive. That's great.
Or calling a piquette low alcohol wine or something, and then having that repositioned for somebody instead of just like this French word that nobody really knows what it means, and it's like something else.
Oh, piquette that's a brilliant one to take on. Yeah, I'm trying to think of fun, like quippy name for it. Like it's out there, like pickaxe, or so you're just like something that like sounds different. Yeah, that's a great idea. That's a perfect example of something that I think tons of people would love.
We need the liquid death. Yeah, we need the liquid death for piquettes. Like what random name to create?
Yeah, rebranding water for those of us who are going to die.
Let me see. Sorry, checking my notes because there's one more thing that I wanted to ask and we got all caught up. Yeah, sorry. You probably have wide network of folks that, like you said, you follow folks on TikTok and Instagram in this space that I probably will never run across. So who are some names maybe that either names or smaller entities, businesses that are doing really cool things in the space of either wine and food media or content creation, these kinds of things that you're involved in? Is there anyone that comes to mind?
Absolutely. I love this question because I agree. I think we all have these spheres, and all I want to do is I want to hear yours and I want to share mine. No, I love this question. In wine and spirit, Jade Marley is the past, present, and future. I think she's brilliant. It's Jahde. And my last name's Marley. She is an educator. She's based in Brooklyn and she's an educator. She is the sort of person who you'll be having a casual conversation with and you like start out talking about, man, what is the deal with Vitis vinifera? And then at the end, you're like, and that's how the colonization of the Americas has really changed what we consume. Like she's just an incredible human being, an incredible brain. So no, I think Jade is definitely someone, if you're interested in wine, I would just keep an eye on this person. Like she's really like a forward thinking, like force to be reckoned with in the business. On like outside of wine, Sarah Wynn has this company called Wynn Coffee Supply, and she's changed the ways a lot of craft is sold. Like Wynn Coffee Supply it specializes in Robusta beans from Vietnam. And prior to her company, Vietnam produced so many coffee beans that were used often in like crystallized things for instant coffee for major brands. And she just changed the perceptions of the ways that now places like Whole Foods sell craft Vietnamese coffee beans, like really due to this one person's company. It's remarkable. And so I think that Sarah is a really good person to keep your eye on in terms of not just coffee trends, but just thinking about the ways certain things get positioned as craft and certain don't. Craft is a great like word that like artisan. What does that mean? That thing where you're like, we're both using the word, but do we define it the same? And I think that Sarah, again, she's just someone to keep an eye on. And Jenny Dorsey is the other person she's a sort of a food activist, and she writes both academic and extremely accessible things about the ways that food is positioned and consumed and the spaces that restaurants hold and the ways that recipes are written. She's given me so much to think about as a recipe writer. Just think about the number of times when you read a recipe, it's like oyster sauce, parentheses, or if you don't have that, this substitute. She wrote this one, I think it was an Instagram post, and I'm just like, she spun this out on the fly. But she wrote this one post that was just about like why we provide what sort of editing we're doing when we provide substitutions for certain ingredients and not others. And like, ooh, it gave me chills. I was like, you're right. What are we saying when we do that? So no, those are three people that I think of just immediately when people say, whose work do you follow? Whose work do you learn a lot from? I just think every time I see them either on my social feeds, at events, anything like that, I just feel like I'm learning a lot.
Awesome. We feel like we've learned a lot from you today for sure. I don't know if Billy, do you have anything to wrap up with?
Yeah, I wanted to. So Brady obviously cooks a little bit more. I wanted to know more about food. I want to know more about your wines from Greece and Crete and Georgia. Maybe list a couple that you're up and coming. Also, we can maybe start with Crete, because I'm listening to Hugh Johnson's The Story of Wine, and it's an ebook that I have. It's probably like 30 hours, and I'm like halfway through. It's going to take me years. I listen to like snippets, but he keeps talking about Crete and how it was called Candia, and how Malvasia was from this port called Menemvasia. So I've had like ancient Greek and Cretan styles of wine in my head for like weeks. So I'm anxious to hear what you have to recommend.
Oh my gosh, I totally want to listen to this. I'm like going to go to my library app after this call and immediately request it.
It's probably like this fat. Like if I had it, like this isn't it, but it's probably about that fat.
It's something like what you said. You listen to snippets. It might be like the next 30 years of my life. I like it. But no, I think in Greece, I'm actually going to, if I can answer them like all as an entity, like in Greece and Cyprus and Crete and Georgia, like looking at the indigenous varieties is so cool. And that's a great place as if you're new to those regions. Like, first of all, if you go to a wine bar with a bunch of Greek wines on the list, I guarantee you the person who put them on there is dying to talk to you about them because they're just like, no one happens into this stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You've got to be pretty, you have to put a California red on your, right? Like you got to put some French, some sort of Bordeaux blend is going to be on there, but like you do not need to put a bunch of indigenous Georgian or Greek grapes on your list. So if you see them, ask the person working there about them. They'll get whoever put them on the list, and like you will have an incredible conversation, and you'll learn a lot and get to taste a lot. I remember I once ordered like a Cypriot wine at a wine bar just because I hadn't heard of the grape before. This was probably a year ago. And I wound up not only meeting the bartender, but also like his mom was at the bar. They were Cypriot. Like it was just they're there for a reason. People who care about them really care about them. So look for the indigenous grapes. I have had really interesting wines from Greece that are blends of indigenous and like French grapes. But I think if you're curious about them, like just go big, go in. And on the Georgian front, I think that I would encourage people, Anglophones can be really sensitive about mispronouncing things, either one or the other. Either we're like so brash about mispronouncing things or we're like so hesitant, right? But like no normal middle ground. And like, it's okay. Like I mispronounce words in English and it's my native language. It's totally okay. And like the grape that's used in a lot of Georgian wines that I love, Mitsavani. It's like Savane. I'm sure a Georgian speaker would hear me say that and be like, oh, sweetie. And so it's okay. That one I think that has such diversity of expression. So I would definitely look for that. I have had orange made with that and it is so rich and nuanced. And then I've had like amber versions of that, like I had with a bowl of popcorn and it was perfect. So I just think that it's really cool to seek out these indigenous grapes from the ancient world. We're getting them more and more in the US than we ever used to for a variety of geopolitical and economic reasons. And just keep your eye out, not be scared to try them. Like, I think that would be even more than producers to just look at like, the more you can taste the same indigenous grapes from different producers, the better, because it is a fairly limited pool. It's not like I'm telling you like, oh my gosh, there's this place in France, you gotta try. There's just not that many of them. And so I think that the more you can drink these indigenous from the ancient world. I don't know the right term to use. I have feelings about old world, new world. I'd love to hear yours. But I think the more you can get your hands on those, the better. What are you excited about? What are you drinking that you're excited about?
I think I pronounce it Mitzvani, but I guess I don't know how to do it either. So yeah, no, I would say I love Georgian wines in general. If you're ever in Sonoma, in Sebastopol, there's a Georgian restaurant you should go to. It's funny because like they have the main thing, their mainstream dumplings, whatever the Georgian mainstream dumplings are.
Oh, the kinkali.
Yeah, Kinkali. So we have a place here, and we went to go eat there, and I was like, oh yeah, we have a Georgian place in LA that we go to. And he's, oh, it's probably all mainstream Georgian food. This is real Georgian food. I was like, what is mainstream Georgian food? And I was just
that stuff's played out.
Yeah. So Kinkali were off the list. But yeah. So I would say like we try a lot of different things. Mitzvani, Saparavi, if you want to go red. But what I would want to emphasize to your point there is, the style, especially in the whites to orange to amber and the longer age, there's so many different styles that I would encourage people to try multiple for that reason too. Because if you have one of the really kind of tannic, long aged orange, then you're like, I just don't like Georgian wine. That could be polarizing. I wouldn't do that. Otherwise, Greek-wise, Brady's the one who went to Greece most recently.
Have you tasted on Santorini?
No, tell me.
Okay.
Wait,
I was going to
before
mention
you go though, Sonoma
mention
Bro.
some-
I just want to get that going because then we'll go on. Brady's gonna have a while on his.
Wait, what's the name of the place in Sonoma? Yeah, I was like going to write it down in my phone.
Sonoma Bro is Pialia, and then the other grape I meant to from. Let me make sure I'm spelling that right. Yeah, I think it's Pialia, and then the other grape from Georgia is Sonoma Bro, or however you say it.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'll let Brady do his Assyrtiko chat here.
Yeah, let's talk Santorini Assyrtiko. Let's do this.
Yeah, I was going to mention Art Space, which is a producer there. Do you know Art Space?
But I do.
Oh,
yeah,
wow. Okay.
I've had
I asked if you had tasted on it because I assumed that you wouldn't have had it if you hadn't actually been there.
Yeah,
because I can't find it. But
yeah, I was gonna say, that's the thing, is it can be hard to find something. The
So
3-tier
hard.
system. I know. Oh, God. Go on.
I loved Art Space. We got a tour. We showed up. We didn't have a tour space or a time reserve, so we just show up, and I told them that was from. I pulled like the wine company card, and so the older gentleman, I can't remember his name, but he's the proprietor. He's definitely in his 70s. Took us around, mumbled some things in Greek and English, and then poured us like their whole list, and was generous and gave us all kinds of stuff. But their Nectari, if I'm pronouncing it right, which is Assyrtiko Etheria Dani blend, was just like absolutely crazy. Like maybe top 4 wine I've ever had. It was like a 2013, so I had some age on it.
Oh.
It was incredible. And when we were at Estate Argios, we had 100% Etheria.
Wow.
They bottled it 100%. They were pouring it in the tasting room, and I was like, "Oh, like I'll buy X bottles." And they're like, "Oh no, we don't have any. Like you just opened one up to pour for me." Like, yeah, we don't sell it. I was like, "Come on, one bottle." So
my heart,
I
too, that's so kind. They were like,
I would pay an absurd amount of money over retail to be able to have that wine here. But yeah, they just So apparently they're one of the only producers that bottles it like that 100%. So.
I hope they're listening to this podcast and they're like, wow, we really changed.
I know they are.
So they are. No, I absolutely love what you said too. I think about that if you're traveling around Northern California and you're like, oh, I didn't make a reservation, I'm not going to get to go anywhere in Napa. And then you're rolling through. I had this experience. A girlfriend of mine had a landmark birthday. And so we went on this like completely ridiculous trip where we wound up like taking trains through the Loire, and we would roll into these cool historic wineries that like are from the 1600s and like their castles in the background. And they're just like, yeah, no problem. You guys want to taste some stuff? No big deal. Yeah. And I was just like, it is really interesting to realize I don't know, not to get in a conversation about capitalism, but I do think it's interesting just the ways that attitudes kind of shift. It goes into what we were saying about why wine can feel so intimidating, right? Like I would hesitate to go to a winery on Long Island without an appointment. Sure. And so like, and then you're in Santorini and you're having like the most exciting varietal wine of your life, and they don't even want to sell you it. They just want you to try it. It just warms my heart, right? That's the sort of thing that I love about wine.
The one thing that I did catch that he said in like pretty good English was he looked me in the eye as he was pouring, because he was pouring very quickly and I was about to go get on a flight, and I was like, I'm going to be so sick. And we had 9 wines. He just pours them back to back. And these are, even though they're white, they're like high alcohol, right? They're bottling at 14.3. And he looks me dead in the eye and he says, I drink a bottle of wine every night. I'm never drunk. And it was like their Vinsanto. That he said, I drink a bottle of Vinsanto every night. I'm never drunk. I'm like, okay. I was like pouring it out underneath the...
Yeah, that's like those articles you read. They're always in like the Independent. That's 104-year-old woman has a Guinness and 2 cigars every day. You're like, what?
Yeah. He's like, I am never drunk. You'll be fine. I was like, okay.
Yeah, I want that man to adopt me. I want to live in his world.
Exactly. If you come across those wines, figure out a way to ship them here. You'll have buyers. So.
Yeah, I'll put them in the backseat of my car. I'll drive them down to you in Baltimore.
Perfect.
We'll throw the name. It turns out it's pronounced Piala, but we'll put the link in the show notes for if anybody wants to go. But yeah, if you have any other Greek wine recommendations, we'd love to hear them. I think and we'll let you go here. We've gone over an hour. But what are those? There's 4 varieties that they're trying to promote across Greece right now. And it's, Assyrtiko, Chenomavro, that starts with an X. And then what are the other 2 again?
Is it the Malavasia?
Malavasia, yeah.
Yeah, it might be. And then
is it the Agorkito? Ayuryitos.
Ayuryidigo. Yeah, that one. Yeah, the Ayuryidigo. It's like a lighter, lighter red. Yeah.
One, I think if you're a Malbec drinker, if you're like, I like an Argentine Malbec, I would look that up. There's often like a lot of wood on it. I think that there's a lot, like if you're someone who's steak night, I think that's like a good thing to look out for. But yeah, I actually didn't know. That's interesting that there's like a concerted push for those for grapes. That's interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember which podcast it is, but one of my studies, they basically had one of the heads of Greek wine culture on, and he was like, we figured out, one, our grapes are too hard to say overall, so we're just going to focus on 4 and just try to make sure people understand what these are like. And then they've had some in blends, according to him, so to try to get people to be like, this is Syrah, and then they try to move them over to like just this grape. But to your point, like they all have their own distinct character. I like describe Sonoma Vero as like the Nebbiolo of Greece. But making those comparisons makes things easier to understand.
I agree. I think that's a really helpful way. It's like the old startup thing of we're the Uber of blank. It's like a very helpful way to get people to understand something. And it's helpful for me too as a consumer to say, I think about it as I'm a beginner for sake. And so when someone's like, okay, if you like X, you'll like this kind of sake. And so I think of it like that. Yeah, if you can say, if you're someone who likes a Syrah, you might want to try this. Hey, whatever gets people to try a glass, I'm happy.
Last little side note, I was just on a ski trip and my buddies are finally coming around to asking me to explain them wines. Or not finally, they come around. But then we went to a Japanese restaurant and I started trying to talk to them a little bit about sake, and that was like, they did not want to hear. They were like, all right, that's enough. We've listened to you talk about wine all day. We don't know the difference between like Daikin-sho and Ginsho.
What the heck is sake?
Baby steps.
It's a whole nother world. I barely understand it. But
yeah, it's so interesting. Oh, there's so many great ones too.
Cool. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all. It's been so lovely speaking with you.
Yeah, this is awesome. We'll do it again. We'll get you on the annual schedule maybe.
I would love that. I'll be driving down with some bottles to you shortly, Brady and Billy. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.
All right. That was our interview with Emily Saladino. I hope everyone got a little bit inspired, maybe to go out and try a Greek wine or perhaps a Georgian wine or just some wine they've never tried before. And on the other side of things, we have our collections left open. So just to wrap up the episode, as we mentioned before, there may still be some shares of the Kurosawa Class collection by the time you guys all check out this episode. And if not, we have a bunch of other really unique collections coming soon. There will be everything ranging from champagne to more whiskey to more Burgundy, of course. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for our collection launches because they're coming hot and fast these days. Until next week, cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.